morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're all here with us today. Beth, thank you for filling in that Linda's ill day. So Beth, you get to hear her again very shortly because she's going to sing the song she's always been scheduled to sing, along with this one that she's filling in on. So we appreciate your doing that. That's what the garden's made up of people who step in when we need somebody to do that. Anyway, glad you're here. Bob Buford is a name that you may or may not recognize. He is the founder of an organization that's called Leadership Network. Leadership Network is comprised of churches from all across the nation and actually around the world. And their primary focus is on training and equipping people, pastors and lay people, to be more effective in their ministry. The garden actually has some involvement, or has had some involvement in Leadership Network. Probably 10 or 12 years ago now, they were trying to figure out about what was called multi-site ministry. Multi-site was a term that had been used to describe things like the garden, that actually is something that comes out of another church, another faith community, but it goes away from the actual home spot of that church and tries to set itself up in something different, like here we are at Beef and Boards. And that was just coming into being. It was sort of becoming a phenomenon at the time, and they wanted to study it with people who were doing it so they could help those who were thinking about trying to do it. So they formed several of these multi-site communities, and we were part of one of those. And it was very helpful, both for us to be able to find all the different ways this is happening and to know that what we were being able to share was going to be helpful to someone else. And so that's the purpose of Leadership Network. Now, Bob Buford wasn't always a part of Leadership Network, obviously, if he founded it. And he was a very, very successful businessman. He made millions, probably billions, in the cable TV industry. And yet, at some point in his life, he hit a wall because he began to think, what of worth and value had he contributed? He certainly lined his own pockets, but was there anything lasting, of any value to go on from there? And as a result of that, and this sort of awakening experience he had, he began to start something called Leadership Network. And he found it a more meaningful thing for him, and he felt that in some way he was able to live out his faith. Now, Bob Buford has written a book, it's been a number of years ago now, entitled Halftime. And the subtitle of that book is basically something along the lines of moving from success to significance. And that's basically what we're talking about today. Success, as he phrases it, is what we're thinking about as a resume. That is, of climbing the corporate ladder, trying to make a name for ourselves, making our career, being the top in our career, versus a legacy, which is that which is longer lasting. And he thinks of that as significance, that which is deeper, more lasting, and ultimately probably more meaningful. Well, in the course of writing that book, he spent some time talking to a lot of different people. And one that he writes about is a person by the name of Howard, who is sort of a driven, compulsive business person. Never says exactly what his business was, but he's president, chairman, and CEO of his own firm, which was the largest of its kind in the city where he lived. And so Buford had dinner with him and was talking to him about his life and basically his success that he had been in his business world. And this is what he said to Bob Buford. My career is what matters. I do 4 client dinners a week. I'm not home much, but my family has to understand that the job comes first. We get quality time on vacation, but that's about it for the year. That's just the way it is. Well, you can see where his focus is and where his life is, and it was obviously intent on building that resume, on really being successful, at least in the way the world tends to term it. And so he makes that quite obvious of what it's all about. Well, that story about Howard is probably a modern-day example of a story that Jesus told that's our Bible passage for today. This is out of Luke's Gospel. And it's said that it's a story Jesus told. And this is how it reads. Speaking to the people, he went on, take care, protect yourself against the least bit of greed. Life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot. Then he told them this story. The farm of a certain rich man produced a terrific crop. He talked to himself, what can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest. Then he said, Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll gather in all my grain and goods, and I'll say to myself, self, you've done well. You've got it made now and can retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life. Just then, God showed up and said, fool, tonight you die. And your barn full of goods? Who gets it? That's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God. Well, that's the point that Jesus was trying to make. Here was someone intent on acquiring and achieving and building this fortune and his life, and yet he was really missing the point as to what life was all about. In fact, Jesus said, life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot. Well, I suppose many of us could say that we've spent a lot of our lives trying to build our resume. That seems to be what is looked highly upon in our world. And I watched some clips as I was preparing for this message, and one of them was about leadership. And the speaker actually shared a thought that really struck me when he said it, and it was this: the day we retire or die, our resume is worthless. And that can kind of strike you right between the eyes because, what is going to be said? I do a lot of funerals, memorial services in the course of my ministry, and it's sort of interesting what people say about a loved one who has died. But I'll tell you, in all the years I've been doing this, there are some things that you very seldom hear, like these.
Surrounded by friends. Facebook friends, that is.
One of the most trustworthy people I ever knew, that we ever knew. We could always trust that he'd stay as late as needed to double check those numbers.
His legacy will live on, not in our memories because we hardly knew him, but in his PowerPoint slides, which were always meticulously prepared.
She was a dedicated worker. She'd show up first thing in the morning and be the last one to leave. Didn't seem to bother her that she had to leave the kids at home. She must have saved a fortune on childcare. Oh, by the way, it was her dying wish that I get her credenza.
Now, wait a minute. He said we wouldn't have to be doing this at all. He always said he would do his own eulogy, and we could just press play.
Drew, incidentally, that's a true story about his dad. His dad actually said, I think he wanted it done right. Said he would do his own, and then all they had to do is press play. Well, that kind of brings the whole thing home. You don't hear that kind of thing when people are gone. You hear about their character traits, about the ways in which they touch lives, about the love they shared with one another. And that's sometimes has to hit us at some point in our lives when we realize what really matters, what really counts in life. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said this: after decades of pursuing money, titles, and ever more stuff, baby boomers are coming to a big realization. Success and security just aren't enough anymore. Well, obviously, if Jesus told a story like that one about the man with all the grain and the big barns and more barns in his day, and we could know current day stories like that, this is sort of a universal issue that people face at one time or another. And in one way or another, we do need some sort of a wake-up call to really realize what matters in life and what is it that we do and what can we share that makes an impact, that is a piece of our legacy that lives on after we're gone. What are we contributing to others? How are we touching lives? What will last when we're long dead and gone? Someone said this about our legacy: legacy is not what's left tomorrow when you're gone. It's what you give, create, impact, and contribute today while you're here that then happens to live on. And so think about those folks we know, maybe those who have died, and what would we say about them? What was meaningful about their lives? What courage did they display to us? How did they share wisdom? What did they teach us? What have we learned that continues to live on, that's a part of their legacy, a part of their impact? It always amazes me sometimes how when I'm working on a message, all of a sudden things will pop up on the news or on TV or in an article of some sort. And that happened this time when I was working on this particular message. There was an article in the sports section of the Star about Corey Redding, who's in the final year of his 3-year contract with the Colts. And the headline on this was Corey Redding asking what his legacy would be. He was wondering what people would say about him because he may wind up retiring after this particular year ends. And are they going to say that he was a football player and that was it? Are they going to say he was a decent football player and a horrible person? What was his legacy? How were people going to remember him? Well, in what ways was he contributing to the world, and how was he making an impact? I also read the eulogy that Mona Simpson gave about her brother, Steve Jobs. Of course, we all know Steve Jobs. You think about Apple and iPads and iPhones and all of those kinds of things. And certainly she talked about that in the eulogy because that was part of his passion. But she deepened that passion, I guess, in a way, because she said he worked at what he loved, and what he really loved was love. Love was his supreme virtue. And then she told about ways in which he had touched the lives of his family, talked about his humility, talked about the deep enjoyment and laughter he got from being with those that he loved the most. They talked about just what kind of person he was that far outlived the way he worked in his company. And probably those people didn't know him that way, but these were the people who knew him best and who could share what that was all about. Well, I think as we talked last week, it's important for us to realize that we are creating our legacy every day of our lives. We are building that legacy right now. What will be said about us when it's all said and done? You know, it's the kind of person we are. It's how we give of our best to the world and how we make this world just a little bit better in the process. You know, we don't have all the time in the world. Again, as we talked about, our lives are limited. They will come to an end at some point. Every one of us will. And we need to be aware of what Leo Buscaglia said. Death is a challenge. It tells us not to waste time. It tells us to tell each other right now that we love each other. And I would say to you, it's not just telling each other, it's living it out. It's really acting in love. It is those gifts of love that we can offer one another, that we can offer our world. And for us to live a life that creates a lasting legacy means that we've got to figure out what really matters to us, what are our values, what really counts, what is worthwhile in our lives, and how do we go about sharing that. And once we figure out those priorities, what's really important, then it's living in tune with those and trying to be true to those in whatever way we can. You know, there are all kinds of ways that it finally sinks in to each of us, and we're all different, and we experience it different, and there are all different kinds of things. But in that article that I mentioned from the Wall Street Journal, it told the story of one guy who finally believed he got it. He had gone to New Orleans to help out after Hurricane Katrina. And he was helping that particular day by filling plastic bags of food and passing it out to people who were displaced because of the hurricane. And they ran out of bags. And he didn't want to just stand around in this parking lot tapping his toes while he waited for the new bags to come. And so he looked around to see who he might be able to help, and he noticed a woman who had apparently had a stroke. And so he offered to carry her bag of food and help her to her home. And so as they walked along, he learned a little bit about her, and he learned that she lived in a 10 by 30 foot trailer with her sister and her sister's 4 children, that she'd had this stroke in the wake of the hurricane and hadn't been able to get any kind of treatment for it, and so she hadn't been able to go back to her teaching job, and she was fearful of losing the home, what she had left of a home at any rate. And she was in dire straits. And yet, even as she answered his questions about what her life was like, whenever she could, she said to him, "Now what can I do for you?" Well, by that time, they arrived at that trailer that she lived in, and she went inside and opened a cabinet door, and with her good arm, pulled out a box of garbage bags and said, "Here, take these. These are for the others." Here was someone who was in great need herself, and who did what she could. Her legacy was one of helpfulness, of generosity, of caring for other people. And she was building that legacy with that tiny little action on that day. Well, instead of giving example, maybe the better thing to do is for us to just think about ourselves and our own lives and to ask ourselves, okay, are we living our resumes or are we living our legacy? What will people say about us when we're gone?